wins the White House, then he's not only going to be useful if Rishi Sunak's Prime Minister, but Starmer, when he was asked the other day, would you make Farage, can you rule out making Farage ambassador to UK ambassador to Washington, refused to answer that question.
Theo, that's not going to happen.
But this is a serious, let me just finish the point. You can say it's not going to happen, but let me just finish this one point. Trump, we haven't got anybody, if Starmer becomes PM, we had David Lammy going over to Washington, and he didn't, from what I've heard, make many inroads whatsoever. It was not a well-received visit. I've got a lot of time for David Lammy, but it was not a well-received visit, particularly with the Trump campaign. Okay, so we then get onto a question of how is Keir Starmer going to ingratiate himself with the leader of the free world?
In case you didn't know, Richard Tice is the leader of the Reform Party. He says, no way, no deals, not going to happen. So what could Nigel Farage offer?
Well, I think he's being a bit mischievous there. But, I mean, look, what is it that the Tories are scared of with Nigel Farage and reform? They think could they bleed out on the right with reform? And basically, whisper it. Don't tell Richard Tice I said this. But they're not too worried about Richard Tice. They are very worried about Nigel wading in, going all guns blazing. How big a role is he going to have? Now, Nigel's doing a bit of press this week, but could he step back a little bit? Could he just keep it on the D-low if they got a little nudge, a little wink that you could get some role? Who knows? With Nigel, it's always playful, isn't it? He's always leaning in somehow.
So what I remember at a by-election 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was Bexley and Old Sidcup, a Tory MP described Richard Tice as a pebble in his shoe, or in the Conservative shoe, if you're talking about sort of, broader electoral reforms. He was talking about changes to the system and so forth. But as he put it to me, this MP put it to me, Nigel Farage banging on about small boats. Now that's a different proposition for the Conservatives. That's really problematic. And if Farage continues with what happened yesterday, and he does more press, and he continues to, and I think he's going to be doing Question Time as well, if he continues to go down that route of really taking part in this campaign, then and then Reform poll, come in with 5 or 6%, and maybe even a couple of MPs as well, then that could cause serious damage to the Conservative Party. But the problem for Nigel Farage is that, and this is the project with Richard Tice, it's to reshape the Conservative Party. Yes. It's not to burn the house down. Because if you end up in a situation where the Conservative Party is reduced to rubble because Reform have run this really hard campaign, and you end up with, 100 Conservative MPs and Reform are to blame, what Richard Tice and Nigel Farage want to do is to remould the Conservative Party in their own image, to shape it. So the right of centre, the Wets, the One Nation caucus, they're pushed to one side, and you have a much more right-wing Conservative Party in their own image. Very much like what UKIP did when David Cameron was Prime Minister in securing that referendum on leaving the European Union. And of course, as Nigel Farage said, they're the Brexit party and ousting Theresa May. And that's what he wants to do. He wants to shape the party in his own image. And if he can do that, then it's going to be really it's going to be difficult for Rishi Sunak.
Yes, well, sorry. Look, I mean, go back not even a few days, and the Tory MPs were having basically a collective meltdown about Nigel Farage. Look, what do we know about Nigel? He's not going to run to be an MP, so he's probably not going to totally dominate this campaign. But still, it's a bit of mischief making, isn't it? Could a little sweetener tell him to call off the dogs? Could that be helpful for Rishi? What do you think? Do you think Rishi will take the offer?
You were talking, Kate, in terms of offering him a personal goodie. I mean, a K or something. I mean, just
K's are 2 a penny now, John.
Well, no, they are. But if it's what could induce Nigel Farage to pull back, to soft pedal on the campaign in a way that reduces their impact, because that would be just a naked betrayal of the Reform. But he would go down as the Reform Party's Ramsay MacDonald in terms of traitorous behaviour. I'm not saying that that's necessarily his worst nightmare. I suspect, none of us know, but I do suspect his idea of the more distant future is to get back into politics in what would then be a different kind of mainstream on the Tory side of the House, the Tory side of politics. But as things stand, he's marching to that under that reform banner. He may be the guy holding the banner rather than Richard Tice. That's the reality too. But you can't start doing favours like soft peddling in exchange for little baubles.
So don't think I've ever disagreed with John Pena live on air before, but I think I might. So basically, what does Nigel want?
Yeah.
Is Nigel that interested in the UK anymore, or has he got his eyes set on grander things?
Yeah.
And what might that country be? Might it be the US? Might it be some kind of relationship with a Trump presidency?
Yeah.
I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Would he be seen as the great betrayer if he did do a deal? I think not. And call me naive, John, but I think Nigel's kind of so big, so charismatic that he'd be able to kind of spin this stitch up with the Tories as a kind of triumph for a Brexiteer reform group. And I think he'd be okay.
No, but if the deal is that he pulls his punches...
So they're not going. Are they going to win a seat? Maybe Lee Anderson's, but who else?
But the interesting Nigel Farage's fortunes. He's got no. If you just take the UK election on its own, he doesn't really win whether it's Starmer as Prime Minister or Sunak as Prime Minister. His fortunes depend on Donald Trump winning the White House. And if Donald Trump wins the White House, then he's not only going to be useful if Rishi Sunak's Prime Minister, but Starmer, when he was asked the other day, would you make Farage? Can you rule out making Farage ambassador to UK ambassador to Washington? Refused to answer that question.
Theo, that's not going to happen.
But this is a serious. Let me just finish the point. You can say it's not going to happen, but let me just finish this one point. Trump, we haven't got anybody. If Starmer becomes PM, we had David Lammy going over to Washington, and he didn't, from what I've heard, make many inroads whatsoever. It was not a well received visit. I've got a lot of time for David Lammy, but it was not a well received visit, particularly with the Trump campaign. Okay, so we then get onto a question of how is Keir Starmer going to ingratiate himself with the leader of the free world? And you could say in a different moment in history, then actually we could step aside from our special relationship with the United States. But we've got Russia knocking on our doorstep here in Europe with Ukraine. We need America. Europe needs America. And we've got to find a way of getting into the room. And if David Lammy can't get into the room, if our current ambassador can't get into the room with Trump, and remember, this is a much more hardline Trump than what happened when he left office. You know, he's not accepting Nikki Haley as his as his candidate for VP. They are going the whole hog on this time round. They don't need to. They think that they're so far ahead of Biden that they don't need to do deals to the mainstream of the Republican Party. We need to find a way in, and you can say what you like about him, but the only person who's got his ear that I know of in British politics, really got his ear of Trump in British politics, is Nigel Farage.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think there's even a percentage chance of a Keir Starmer government offering Nigel, maybe not ambassadorship, but anything?
We have to be in the room with Trump. It's in Britain's interest.
So if he should do it.
I'm not saying if Trump is president, we have to find a way into that room. We have to find a way of getting that guy to listen to us. And you can say whatever you like. We've got to find a way of getting him to listen to us.
On this show, there's nothing I love more than out there suggestions, and that is an out there suggestion.
I know it is. I'm not pretending otherwise.
No.
But we've got to.
I love it. But if it happens. If Nigel Farage, if there's a Keir Starmer government and Nigel Farage ends up the British ambassador in Washington DC,
I'll be your new US correspondent, John.
I will treat you to the best and the most expensive dinner you've ever imagined.
I get that it is so far out there, but all I'm saying is we've got to find a way into the room with Trump if he becomes president. And I don't know anybody else in British politics who has could remotely get an audience other than Nigel Farage.
I wonder if, by the way, how far Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are on the same page in this thing. If Nigel Farage's
Nigel's just doing Nigel, right?
Exactly. If Nigel Farage's distant vision is becoming a bigger player than anyone would have imagined in the right of British politics, using what he's doing now as a stepping stone. And would Richard Tice see it that way? Is Richard Tice on a Tory remodelling campaign, or is Tice doing something else, trying to just rebuild the entire edifice?
I was talking to somebody earlier, and I can't remember who it was now. Sorry, I've got short memory. But we were saying there were two politicians that stood out for us in the past decade as politicians, people that other people want to cross the road to touch, to talk to cut through. They hate, they love, they can do politics. Two names. What are they? Theo.
In the last decade, it's Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage.
Exactly. Nigel is in a league of his own with Boris in the last decade in terms of landing politics. Could that land him a job in America? It sounds balmy to us here in the UK, who've never seen him land even a parliamentary seat. But could it? Who knows?